Okay, hope you can hear me. Good morning. Okay, a couple of, I guess, housekeeping things. Hard to believe it's already December 1st. Just a reminder that your final exam is December 17th. The last day of class is December 9th. Oh no, that's the week from tomorrow. That means we have only 2 more classes. All right, so today we will, I told you I'm going to go quickly through the Storm of Steel. On Thursday, there's a packet of World War I poems posted on Blackboard. We're going to do the poems. And then on Tuesday, I guess next day is the last class, we'll be doing the packet of artwork, which isn't posted yet, but it will be. So, sorry about the squeezing everything at the end. It always seems to work out that way. So again, the final being the 17th means that on the 15th, I'll post the final. You'll have to get it to me by 5 o'clock. I'll send an announcement by 5 o'clock on the 17th, together with the term paper. Okay. Really thought we had one more day. Anyway, the work that I'm going to talk about today, the Ernst Junger Storm of Steel. Very interesting piece of writing about World War I from a very interesting fellow, and very much the antithesis of All Quiet on the Western Front, and for that matter, even Farewell to Arms. Very interesting guy, Ernst Junger, and he is very complex. I mean, a very complex figure. Most interesting people are. And there's certain contradictions in his life that have been noted. But he probably has presented in Storm of Steel the most well-known and one of the most publicly recognizable accounts of World War I. It's just hard to categorize it. It's not exactly a novel. I guess it's sort of a memoir, but we'll have to decide exactly what it is. So first, who was this guy, Ernst Junger? Well, he lived a very long time. He was born the 29th of March, 1895. He died February 17th of 1998. He was 103 years old. Saw a lot in his life, right? And he had a very interesting background. He was a highly decorated Imperial German soldier. Imperial meaning during the time of the German Empire, and that's the period we're talking about, World War I. He was an author, and he was an entomologist. What exactly is an entomologist, anyone? He's a guy, is a scientist whose specialty is he studies insects, bugs. That background is going to show up here and there in Storm of Steel. Junger was the son of a successful businessman and a chemist. And he had a very affluent upbringing, against which he really rebelled. And he wanted some adventure in his life. So the way he found adventure to begin with was he joined a group known as the Wandervogel. I don't know whether it came up already maybe in class or not. Die Wandervogel were German youth who were very nationalistic, very right-wing, and who part of their organizational activity was to go hiking all through Germany, up and down the mountains and everything else. Again, very much connected to the German soil and the very right-wing nationalist ideologies of the time. They tended to be somewhat anti-Semitic. So that's how he first engaged his rebellion against his father. And then he joined the French Foreign Legion, which was a problem because basically that was illegal. because in joining the French Foreign Legion, he basically was fighting for a foreign country. But his father, because of all his connections, managed to bail him out of that mess. And he was back in Germany before World War I began, and found his way into combat, in fact, in World War I. And his experiences in combat are the substance of this work of his, is in German, im Stahlgewitter, in the storm of steel. It's the English translation. He was wounded many times in World War I, and he mentions those occasions in the course of this book. And for his various woundings, he received what was known as the Pour le Mérite, a really important award, a military award and decoration, especially for someone of his rank. He wasn't even all that up in the rank yet. In the aftermath of World War II, he was treated with some suspicion because many people felt that perhaps he was a fellow traveler with the Nazis. After all, he was very nationalistic, very gung-ho on war, which is clear in this work. And there are a lot of elements you could find in his writings and his worldview and that would have dovetailed very nicely with the Nazis. But in fact, that's not what happened exactly, as you'll see. He was also somewhat of a philosopher, I guess you would say. He wrote about the impact of materialism in modern society, which again could dovetail with Nazi views of materialism as opposed to a connection and a association with the state, which was all important. But he really wasn't espousing a Nazi worldview, but he was quite controversial in some of his statements. And we'll see exactly some of the things he did during World War II that are sort of interesting and somewhat contradictory. Anyway, he ended his life as a really honored figure of the German establishment, won many, many awards. And he was always, still being charged with glorifying war, which was not an unfounded charge. Based on what he wrote in Storm of Steel, he clearly was someone who glorified war. But on the other hand, he wasn't someone that you could just arbitrarily characterize as a Nazi fellow traveler or whatever. One of the unfortunate things nowadays is that people fling all sorts of terms around and don't either know what they mean and or don't realize the significance of what they're saying, or are very superficial and don't quite comprehend the fine points of these ideologies. To everyone that you don't agree, it's a fascist, it's a Nazi, it's a this, it's a that. It's not so simple, right? The point of education is or should be to make it clear that there are various subtleties in all of these different tags and categorizations. And before you start shouting down people and calling them this, that, or the next thing, you ought to know what you're talking about. And so in the case of Junger, there were many, especially after World War II, during the Cold War period, who said, yeah, the guy's a Nazi. He wasn't Nazi. One could argue that, there were certain elements of his belief system that, maybe the Nazis would have, felt comfortable with. And in fact, they did. But you can't just paint someone with one hue and not look at the, subtleties. As I said, he was born into a rather wealthy family. He was born in Heidelberg, Germany, a beautiful town, if you've ever been there, a great university town. He was the elder of 6 children. His father was a chemical engineer. His father's name was Ernst Georg Junger, and his mother, Carolina Lampels. So 2 of his siblings died as infants, and his father acquired quite a bit of wealth in the process of potash mining. He went to school in Hanover, which is central Germany, from 1901 to 05. And During 1905 to '07, he boarded various schools in Hanover and Braunschweig. He rejoined his family in 1907 in Rehburg, and then he went to school in Wunsdorf, important from 1907 to 12. During this time, he developed his passion for adventure and for adventure novels and for entomology, of all things, the study of insects and bugs. He spent some time as an exchange student in France in the September of 1909. And with his younger brother, Friedrich Georg Junger, he joined the Wandervogel, as I said, this movement of young nationalistic German young men who traveled by foot, the length and breadth of Germany, up the mountains and down the mountains and everything else. In 1913, he was a student at the Hameln Gymnasium. In November, he traveled to Verdun and enlisted in the French Foreign Legion for 5 years. He was stationed in a training camp actually in Algeria, Northern Africa, which was then French. And he then deserted and traveled to Morocco, but was captured, returned to the camp, and 6 weeks later was dismissed from the French Foreign Legion due to the intervention of the German Foreign Office at the request of his father, who was rather well connected, and said his son was too young. Anyway, he was a minor. Then he was sent to boarding school in Hanover, and that was pretty much the end of his elementary years of education, pre-university years. On the 1st of August, 1914, which was right after the start of World War I, Junger volunteered for the 73rd Infantry Regiment of the Hanoverian 19th Division, and after training was transported to the Western Front of France. He was wounded for the first time, one of many times, in April of 1915. While he was convalescing, he decided to enlist as an officer aspirant, and he was promoted to lieutenant on the 27th of November, 1915. He became a platoon leader and gained a reputation for his various combat exploits and his various initiatives in offensive patrol. He was not a laid-back or lily-livered guy. He was like big on gung-ho on actually, as you'll see, moving forward and going over the top and engaging in battle. During the Battle of the Somme, you might remember the Battle of the Somme, one of the early and deadly battles of the war. The nearly obliterated remains of a village, which he writes about, Guimont, his platoon took up a frontline position in a defile that had been shelled until it consisted of just a couple of bits of a wall that were left, but strewn with rotting corpses all over the place. And he doesn't hesitate or flinch at describing in great detail, as you either saw or will see, the visual image of the bodies strewn all over the Western Front. In fact, he writes, as the storm raged around us, I walked up and down to my sector. The men had fixed bayonets. They stood stony and motionless, rifle in hand, on the front edge of the dip, the part of the ground that was blown out, gazing into the field. Now and then, by the light of a flare, I saw steel helmet by steel helmet, blade by glinting blade. I was overcome by a feeling of invulnerability. We might be crushed, but surely we could not be conquered. So this guy obviously was, steel-nerved and didn't flinch at the prospect of conflict with the enemy and the potential for bloody, conflict and death and suffering and everything else. He, it's rolled off his back. That's what he wanted, right? Was to have the full experience, all of the gore and the gore and the glory. In fact, there's a line that everyone, I suppose, is familiar with, but no one realized actually it came from Ernst Junger. Ernst Junger was the guy that said, "That which doesn't kill me strengthens me, and that which kills me strengthens me even more." So very much the battlefield type. The platoon he was leading was relieved, but Junger was wounded by shrapnel in the rest area of Combes in France, and he was hospitalized. His platoon reoccupied the position on the eve of the Battle of Guillemont and was obliterated in a British offensive. He was wounded now for the third time in November of 1916 and awarded the Iron Cross First Class in January of 1917. Iron Cross First Class is a big military honor in Germany. So he has that, plus the Pour le Mérite. He's like draped in big time military awards and medals, and it's not over yet. In the spring of 1917, he was promoted to commander of the 17th Company and stationed in Cambrai. Cambrai was one of the major battles in France in World War I. And then he was transferred to Langemarck in Belgium, another very important battle in July of that year. And his actions against the advancing British troops included forcing retreating soldiers to join his resistance line at gunpoint. In other words, you couldn't retreat if you were under his command. Either you went along with him or you were shot. He was a rather demanding guy. For that, he received yet another award, the House Order of Hohenzollern. Hohenzollern, of course, are the original ruling family of Germany, and the Kaiser, the last Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was the last Hohenzollern. And that was the end of that line when the Germans lost World War I. On the 25th of August, he was wounded for the seventh and final time in another battle, was shot through the chest and bleeding profusely. It's amazing. Some orderlies came to try and help him out. The orderlies were shot to death. He managed to survive, even though he's bleeding profusely. So this guy was indefatigable, killing him. And for that, he received the Wound Badge First Class. Throughout the war, he kept a diary, and the diary is the basis for Storm of Steel. So one could say perhaps that Storm of Steel, I'm trying to figure out how to categorize it, maybe diary is the best way to look at it. Because it's not a novel, although it has plenty of action, but it doesn't even remotely resemble a novel form. So maybe memoir or diary is the best way to view it. During the interwar period between World War I and II, he served as a lieutenant in the army of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, of course, was the very brief period of 12 or so years, from 1919 to 1932, when Germany was finally a republic with a constitution and a sort of Western orientation with equal voting rights and so on and so forth, freedom, all sorts of freedoms. Didn't last very long. We know what happened in 1933. But he was a lieutenant in the army during the Weimar years. But he also studied marine biology, zoology, botany, philosophy. He became a well-known, as I said, entomologist. In Germany, an important entomological prize, by the way, was named for him. Now, the Weimar Republic was a very interesting, really interesting period. And it used to be, for a while, I taught a course on the Weimar Republic, known as Berlin in the 20s. Weimar was the first German experiment with democracy. And because there was now freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of everything, all of a sudden, Germans who had felt somewhat repressed until that point allowed their creativity to come out. And during that period, the Weimar Republic, all of a sudden, the greatest innovations in literature and art and architecture, and they all suddenly blossomed. But of course, there were many who were opposed to that because they felt this modernism and this departure from traditionalism and so on was destroying society. We've had this happen many, many times in the course of history. And so there was a swift reaction against Weimar liberalism and modernism. And at various points during the way, between, let's say, 1919 and 1932, or better, 1929, there were growing periods of extremism, either the left or the right, the communists, the fascists / Nazis, and so on. But somehow everything used to work out during this period because all in all, things were going pretty well. But then, of course, 1929 brought the stock market crash and the collapse of the German economy and the world economy, and then the right wing, as well, frankly, is the left wing. But you see, that's what this democracy business will do for you. We've got a better idea. And the better idea ended up, unfortunately, being Hitler's better idea. And people like Junger, who were always dead opposed to democracy because it just wasn't in their blood. You know, they were old-time German aristocratic or Junker type, militaristic types from the past. You know, they weren't big on popular democracy. So even though he served in the army during the Weimar period, Juncker was always opposed to Weimar democracy. He was opposed to the liberal values, you know, liberty, security, ease and comfort, and so on. He believed in pain and sacrifice, a good Prussian soldier. And it said at that time that he came up with this line I just quoted before: "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." Now, being that he expressed great nationalism and great militarism in this work, needless to say, the Nazis courted him. They saw kindred voice in Junger. And, you know, it's an interesting contradiction. On the one, I mean, the truth is that there is evidence that on the one, he was sort of gentlemanly anti-Semite, I guess you would call it. But on the other hand, he rejected the blood and soil doctrine of the Nazis, because he was more of an intellectual, and this sort of, you know, low life and ignorant racism of the Nazis sort of he found repulsive. He never expressed loyalty to Hitler outright, but he didn't rebuke outright the Nazi regime either. On the other hand, he belonged to a veterans group, you know, the Traditionsverein der 73er, the veterans organization of the Hanoverian regiment that he fought in. And when the Nazis came to power, of course, the Jews were all expelled. When the Jewish members of his veterans organization were thrown out, he quit. His brother also. They both quit the organization because of the expelling of these Jewish members. So it's a strange thing. I mean, he wasn't exactly pro-Jew or whatever, but on the other hand, he reacted to what he thought was an injustice. Not only that, he was very much a cultured human being. And during World War II, of course, the Nazis occupied France in the north, and the collaborationist Vichy government in the south. And during that time, Junger spent a lot of time in the Hotel Georges V, where he met some of the most important cultural figures of the day, Picasso, the painter, and Jean Cocteau, and various others. And because of his connections in France, amazingly, he was able to save many Jews because he knew what was going on. And he passed on information about upcoming transports of Jews to concentration camps. And therefore, he was able, through a connection or a network that was existent in France at the time, to actually save their lives. So a very strange relationship that he had. He was also on the fringes of the Stauffenberg bomb plot. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Claus von Stauffenberg was a German aristocrat and a military figure. And somewhere late in the war, it was in the summer of 44, it was July of 44, there was an attempt, a plot to kill Hitler, to assassinate Hitler. Was made into a great movie. The code name for the plot was Valkyrie. And a number of years ago, the movie Valkyries was made, and it dealt with this whole plot and Stauffenberg group that planned to bomb the location of Hitler. What happened was they knew that Hitler was in the he had a like hideaway in the Alps, and he was speaking in his office. The office had a very, very large and very strong concrete desk that he used. Someone managed to put a bomb in an attaché case and stick it under the desk, and it actually detonated and blew up, but it didn't kill Hitler. It temporarily made him deafened him, and he suffered some injuries to his body, but it didn't kill him. Of course, it didn't take very long to figure out who parties were involved in this, and they were very quickly lined up against the wall and summarily shot in a firing squad, including Stauffenberg. In some distant way, Junger was apparently on the fringes of this bomb plot, but was not implicated and managed to survive that too. After the war, like I said, he was under some suspicion of being a Nazi fellow traveler, whatever, but obviously he wasn't. And on his 100th birthday in 1995, he was given many awards and a lot of praise, and he was actually able to participate in an event between the head of state in Germany, it was Helmut Kohl, I think at the time, and the French president, and a sort of rapprochement to sort of symbolically show that the Germans and the French had gone beyond World War I and World War II, and now there was an amity and a friendship and a positive relationship between these two former enemies. And he, Junger, was part of that celebration. So he had a very interesting life, to say the least. Now, this book, Storm of Steel, is clearly a work that praises militarism and the glory of fighting and the nobility that comes out of combat and so on. I mean, this is the antithesis or the other side of the coin of Erich Maria Remarque. I mean, this guy is not apologetic about anything, quite the contrary. I wanted to quote one line. It's a very interesting introduction by Michael Hoffman. Michael Hoffman is a very well-known German translator. And he obviously did a translation of the German of this book. And he says in the introduction, if you have the book, on page, it's Roman numeral 19, in the introduction, in the strangest way, Storm of Steel isn't really a personal book at all. It's about the war. In his World War II diaries, there's this very suggestive idea, quote, war isn't like a cake that the two sides divide up between them to the last crumb. There's always a piece left. That's the piece for the gods and remains outside the argument. And it elevates the fighting from sheer brutality and demonic violence. Homer knew and respected it, end quote. In other words, he's already indicating the sort of status of war as a noble encounter. And he's pointing to Homer and the Odyssey, who glorifies war. And obviously the connection is that any war is a national expression of the spirit and soul of the nation. I mentioned, I think in the past, one of the most important writers, German writers of the 20th century, my favorite writer actually, is Thomas Mann, M-A-N-N. Thomas Mann won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think it was 1922. But Mann went through an interesting transformation in his life. Thomas Mann had a brother, Heinrich Mann, who was 4 years older. And they actually had a falling out over this. Heinrich Mann, his brother, was a very liberal individual, anti-war, and very much a Francophile. He was enamored of French culture and French history and so on. His brother Thomas, his younger brother, at least early on, was a very nationalistic German, very much a militaristic German. When World War I broke out, that's when they had their parting of the ways. Thomas Mann was gung-ho on World War I. And he said, you know, there's a difference between we Germans and the rest of the world. There are two kinds of entities. There are two groups of nations, shall we say. There are those that represent civilization. Now, of course, it translates into civilization, but that's not really the way he saw it. We'll see in a minute. And there are nations that are Kultur, they're represented by culture. Civilization, he said, those are the nations, most of the Western nations that are, you know, grounded on the values and the teachings of, you know, the Bible and so on and so forth. He said, we Germans are not like that. We have Kultur. We're a cultural nation. And our culture is based on glorifying war. Because if you look at the history of Germany from way before it even was Germany, every step of the way to becoming the German Empire was preceded by a war. We mentioned this earlier on in the course. The German Empire emerged after Bismarck successfully negotiated 3 wars. And all through German history, war is what not only characterized the German-speaking entities, but in fact, ultimately united all those German-speaking duchies and kingdoms and everything else, because war was the cohesive, you know, element that made Germans Germans. And basically that's what we find in Junger. And even the form of warfare in World War I, a mutual or reciprocal siege, seemed somehow suitable for an epic. And Junger saw this war, this First World War, as sort of a Greek epic, like the Iliad or the Odyssey. All right, so now we begin the story of World War I from the German perspective and from the perspective of a militaristic German. And he doesn't flinch in his description of what's out there. But it's almost as if it were a newsreel, because whatever he encounters, that's what we see. And he doesn't mince words, and he doesn't ameliorate images. They're what they are. Might have mentioned earlier on in the course, there was a great movie, I think it was last year, called 1917. If you get a chance, you really should see it. During the original lockdown, when I had all this time and nowhere to go, so it's time to catch up on various books and movies and everything. So I had the opportunity to view 1917. What a movie. It goes through World War I really through the eyes of the combatants, but you go with them. You're like, they're in their body, and you just move forward through the trenches, over the trenches, through no man's land, and you just, it doesn't stop. It's just an unending, you know, word like a newsreel, or more, it's more than that. It's just like you're behind the camera, you're just moving along with it. Every horrible thing along the way is right there in front of you. And that's basically what's happening here. So he starts out on page 5. The first chapter is called In the Chalk Trenches of Champagne. That's from his own life, of course, and that's in part of France where he began his military undertakings in World War I. And in the second paragraph, he says, we had come from lecture halls, school desks, and factory workbenches, and over the brief weeks of training, we had bonded together into one large and enthusiastic group. Grown up in an age of security, we shared a yearning for danger, the experience of the extraordinary. We were enraptured by war. We had set out in a rain of flowers and a drunken atmosphere of blood and roses. Surely the war had to supply us with what we wanted. The great, the overwhelming, the hallowed experience. No finer death in all the world then. Right? What does this sound like? should remind you of the beginning of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is described also, these youngsters, many of them all fired up by their teacher and drunken with war fever and anxious to have the, ennobling experience of fighting. And then he doesn't finish the quote, but he starts the quote, "No finer death in all the world then." Well, remember in the movie version of All Quiet on the Western Front, it's right in the beginning. In the novel, it's a few pages later on, but he's basically quoting the same line from Horace that the teacher was quoting to his students. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's good and proper to die for one's country. So both accounts, All Quiet on the Western Front and Storm's Field, begin the same way, with a description of these individuals coming together, forming a group, forming a sense of community. And I've mentioned it before, when Hitler came into power, he spoke always of the Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people, of course, being Aryans. And that Volksgemeinschaft was patterned and modeled on the veterans of World War I, who formed a unique community because of their unique experiences. No one else shared them. And not surprisingly, in the interwar years, when these veterans suddenly felt lost and, drifting and alienated, now they had a cause once again to give them a sense of purpose. And they were the first and the most vociferous advocates of what the Nazis had to offer. So that's how it begins. And then it goes on. In the bottom of the next page, immediately afterwards, groups of dark figures emerged to the empty village street, carrying black bundles on canvas stretchers or firemen's lifts of their folded hands. I stared with a queasy feeling of unreality at a blood-spattered form with a strange contorted leg hanging loosely down, wailing, "Help, help," as if if sudden death still had him by the throat. He was carried into a building with a Red Cross flag draped over the doorway. What was that about? War had shown its claws and stripped off its mask of coziness. It was all so strange, so impersonal. We had barely begun to think about the enemy, that mysterious, treacherous being somewhere. This event, so far beyond anything we had experienced, made such a powerful impression on us that it was difficult to understand what had happened. It was like a ghostly manifestation in broad daylight. So this is his first encounter with the immediacy of death, but not just death, the horrible death, the mutilation of the body and the leg dangling and everything else. Well, this is going to go all through the story, all through the account, and he isn't going to flinch, because what's going to happen is that you develop an total insensitivity. What's the big deal? Now you've seen it once, now you're going to see it a million other times, and you're numb to the whole experience. And on top of that, he has always had this interest in entomology, interest in bugs and insects, and you'll see at various points, he'll describe these parts of human beings, that whatever's left dangling from a tree or a barbed wire fence, as though they were basically insects or bugs, and he can look at them and describe them with the same total, coldness and insensitivity that he does in his etymological studies, or entomological studies. Okay, then a few lines later, even though the shelling could recommence at any moment, I felt irresistibly drawn to the site of the calamity. Next to the spot where the shell had hit dangled a little sign where some wag had written "Ordnance this way," right? He's drawn to these scenes of suffering and death. It's, like a person driving down the highway and there's an accident in another lane and you just can't help but stop and, see what's going on. And I don't know, maybe there's something about us in the id, to talk to Freud, but maybe there's something about us that sort of draws us like a magnet to suffering and death and Annihilation, as long as we're not in it, we're the onlooker. And then on page 9, at last we dropped into one of the communication trenches that wound their way through the night like white snakes to the front. Then I found myself standing between a couple of traverses, lonely and shivering, staring hard into a line of pines in front of the trench, where my imagination conjured up all sorts of shadowy figures, while the occasional stray bullet slapped into the boughs and somersaulted down with a whistle. The only diversion in the seemingly endless time was being collected by an older comrade and trotting off together down a long, narrow passage to an advanced sentry post, where once again it was our job to gaze out into the terrain in front. I was given a couple of hours to try to find an exhausted sleep in a bare chalk dugout. When the sky lighted, I was pale and clay-daubed, and so was everyone else. I felt I had lived a sort of mole's life for many months already. The way he describes the way he looks, daubed with white clay and all, it's like he's a walking corpse. But he feels, and he's just started. Well, it feels like he's been living a life of a mole underground for many, many months already. It just became part of him, and there was no longer any shock or reaction. On the next page, on 10, he says, the endless, exhausting spells of sentry duty were bearable so long as the weather happened to be fine, or even frosty, but it became torture once the rain set in. Once the wet had saturated the canvas sheeting overhead in your coat and uniform and trickled down your body for hours on end, you got into a mood that nothing could lighten, not even the sound of the splashing feet of the man coming towards you to relieve you. Dawn lit exhausted, clay smeared figures who pale and teeth chattering. All right, we've already spoken about what the trench experience was, and there you have it in part, you know, the cold, the rain, the shivering, and so on. Then on page 13, it's very interesting. On top of 13, he says, you know, after only a short time with the regiment, we become thoroughly disillusioned. Instead of the danger we'd hoped for, we had been given dirt, work, and sleepless nights, getting through which required heroism of a sort, but hardly what we had in mind. Worse still was the boredom, which is still more enervating for the soldier than the proximity of death. In other words, a soldier, and generally, you know, we came here for some excitement. We wanted to go out and do what we had to do. And the worst thing is when you have to sit here and do nothing. And he said boredom is worse. It's more enervating than the proximity of death. In other words, going out there, facing the enemy with the possibility of being killed is less draining than actually sitting around bored and doing nothing. So clearly this is a soldier. This is a guy who, you know, laughs in the face of death. A contributory factor in the chronic overtiring of the troops was the way the trench warfare, which demanded a different way of keeping one's strength up, was still a novel, unexpected phenomenon as far as the officer corps was concerned, right? Because trench warfare is new. I mean, it existed before, but you know, to the extent it defined the Western Front of World War I, that had never existed before. And so there were issues, and the, you know, the officer corps, they didn't spend their time in the trenches. So they weren't aware of what these soldiers had to deal with. And, you know, for these chronic overtiring of these troops was the way the trench warfare was conducted. The great number of sentries and incessant trench digging were largely unnecessary and even deleterious. You know, they had to dig further and further and further, more and more and more trenches, because that was worthless. And it was worse than worthless. It was draining. It was, you know, it had a negative effect. It's not a question of the scale of the earthworks, but of the courage and condition of the men behind them. The ever deeper trenches might protect against the odd head wound, but also made for a defensive and security conscious type of thinking, which we were loath to abandon later. So what's his complaint? Perfectly consistent with everything he said. He said, you know what the trouble with the trenches? It breeds a defensive attitude, meaning what? He said the trench, the idea behind it was to protect the soldier. That's a defensive attitude as opposed to offensive. Offensive is going out and going after the enemy. and trenches precluded that because you're hunkered down. So that's his complaint against the trench, and it's consistent with his gung-ho, over the top, and keep moving attitude. And so he said that's the whole problem here, because eventually that attitude of a defensive stance, that was the whole problem with the war. That's why it went on for 4 years, because everyone was hunkered down and there was no movement. It had been better, he said, without the trenches. It would just gone forward, faced the enemy, and did what we had to do, and things would have ended up however they ended up, but it wouldn't have a long, protracted, drawn out 4-year affair. Moreover, the demands made by the maintenance of the trenches were becoming ever more exorbitant. The most disagreeable contention was the onset of thaw, which caused the frost-cracked chalk facings of the trenches to disintegrate into a sludgy mess. We spoke about that. Now, the different seasons in Europe, Western Europe, Northern Europe, are horrible. They're brutal. The winters are brutally cold. The snow, the ice, it's there for months. But then what? Then the spring thaw comes along, as he said, and what happens is all of a sudden everything starts melting. But in the meantime, the walls of the trench have been weakened and loosened because of the weight of the snow and the ice, and so they collapse along with the melting snow and ice into the trench. And not uncommon is the appearance of a corpse or two that had been embedded at some point in the snow and ice, and now all of a sudden was revealed when the melting took place. Okay, on page 23, it's a new chapter, Les Éparges, the place in French battlefield. The tender green of young leaves shimmered in the flat light. We followed hidden, twisting paths toward a narrow gorge behind a front line. Okay, so it's told of this imminent attack. And then at the end of the next paragraph, then death's call slipped through the ranks, ambulancemen to the front. A little later, we passed the spot that had been hit. Casualties have been removed. Bloody scraps of cloth and flesh had been left on bushes around the crater. In other words, the bomb projectile landed, cratered the earth, and now the ambulance corps there to remove whatever's left in the way of human beings, and that included bloody scraps of cloth, flesh, that had been left on bushes around the crater, a strange and dreadful sight that put me in mind of the butcher bird that spikes its prey on thorny bushes. Remember, this is a zoologist and entomologist, so he's seeing everything from the perspective of his scientific background. And as they're lifting off the remains of these soldiers, brings to mind a butcher bird. And what a butcher bird does, a very long beak, but a very pointed and stiletto-like beak. It locates its prey down below, and it goes in and jabs it, like with a machete or whatever. Not a machete. It's more like the spike on a helmet, on a German helmet, and that sort of reminds him of what's going on here. And he can only relate it, I guess, to his scientific studies, but he can't relate it to actual human beings, Ryan. On the next page, he said, we entered the battle-tramped realm of the infantrymen. The area around the jumping off position had been deforested by shells. In the ripped-up no man's land lay the victims of the attack. Still facing the enemy, their gray tunics barely stood out from the ground. A giant form with a red, blood-spattered beard stared fixedly at the sky, his fingers clutching the spongy ground. A man tossed in a shell crater, his features already yellow with his impending death. He seemed not to want to be looked at. He gave us a cross shrug and pulled his coat over his head and lay still. Right? Very poignant and unadulterated images of these soldiers he's counting, but with a sort of what's the word for it? A cold and unemotional summary of the surroundings, sort of almost clinical, cold clinical view of things. He's been totally separated from any emotion, passion, or sense of common human feeling for one's fellow human being. The enemy is just another vermin or another rodent or another whatever that has to be eliminated. And therefore, there's no time or inclination to feel any sort of sympathy or horror at what you're viewing. Ambulancemen, we had our first fatality. A shrapnel ball had ripped through the rifleman Stolta's carotid artery. 3 packs of lint were sodden with blood in no time. In a matter of seconds, he bled to death. Next to us, a couple of ordnance pieces, loosed off shells and so on. So what is that all about? Again, with this coldness, this is one of his own men. It's not the enemy. This guy Stolta. And he was hit by shrapnel. Shrapnel, some metal pieces that go flying after a bomb hits the earth. And what it did is it ripped through his carotid artery. What is the carotid artery? It's that thing here in the neck that brings blood to the brain. The carotid artery is a very important artery because it carries a huge amount of blood. It has to nourish the brain. If you cut the carotid, you will bleed out in no time. The blood will just go flying like a gusher. So without any great fanfare, he announces his colleague, his comrade, has been hit and carotid artery is ripped, and he bleeds out, and basically without much shock or anything, talks about all the blood-sodden lint, because everything is now soaked with the blood that's coming out of this guy. Okay, in the middle of page 25, his come on, man, get up, we're moving out. I woke in a dew-sodden grass. Through a stuttering swathe of machine gun fire, we plunged back in our communications trench and moved to a position on the edge of the wood previously held by the French. A sweetish smell and a bundle hanging in the wire caught my attention. In the rising mist, I leaped out of the trench and found a shrunken French corpse. Flesh-like moldering fish gleamed greenishly through slits in the shredded uniform. All around, a few lines later, were dozens more rotted, dried, stiffened to mummies. Right? What has he found? These are French soldiers that were caught in the barbed wire, and that's where they remained. And the bodies, obviously, decomposed in the uniform. Right? So there's this horrible smelling, a moldering, fish-like smell of the flesh, and the corpse itself, it says it's a shrunken French corpse, because what happens, the skull and everything else, of course, the time shrinks. So that's the way they've been left, and that's the way he finds them. Now, when we get to the poetry, and especially get to the artwork of World War I, you'll see this more graphically, and not with necessarily nonchalance. Not like you're looking at some flowers in the field. I mean, it's much more graphic and full of emotion. But for Junger, the hardened soldier, really not much here to get excited about. On the bottom of 28, it says, my comrade, volunteer Kohl, kept up that North German sang-froid that might have been made for such a situation. All right, the expression of sang-froid, if we speak French, means cold blood. And what he's saying is this comrade of his, this guy Kohl, was a North German. And he said, typical of North Germans are the sang-froid, they're cold-blooded, nothing phases them. And he said, that might be good. It might be good to be somewhat cold-blooded and unemotional, because you're not going to make it through this. He was chewing and squeezing on a cigar that refused to draw, and apart from that, looked rather sleepy. Nor did he allow himself to be upset when suddenly to the rear of us there was a clattering as of 1,000 rifles. It turned out the intensity of the shelling had caused the wood to catch fire. Great tongues of flame climbed noiselessly up the tree trunks. And then he goes and describes it as something like the Lions of Perth for their experience in the witch's cauldron. And he uses allusions to medieval literature and witches' cauldrons and the devil and all these. pretty appropriate analogy, I guess, what was going on around them. The dance of death and all of the macabre horrors that you find in a horror movie. That's exactly what they're finding there, and that's what all of this reminds them of, and the leaping tongues of flame that are consuming the forest. Fits very nicely. A few pages later, sorry, on page 31, so I threw down my haversack and knapsack and ran toward the trench we had come from. From all sides, wounded men were making tracks towards it for the shelled woods. The trench was appalling, choked with seriously wounded and dying men. A figure stripped to the waist, with ripped open back, leaned against the parapet, top of the trench. Another, with a triangular flap hanging off the back of his skull, emitted short, high-pitched screams. This was the home of the great god Pain. And for the first time, I looked through a devilish chink into the depths of his realm, and fresh shells came down all the time. All right, it's a wordplay. One of the gods, and I guess it's Scandinavian mythology, is Pan, P-A-N. It's turned him into the great god Pain, right? And he doesn't hesitate or flinch at describing what he's looking at. One guy, the back of his head is sort of a flap now, it's just hanging in the back. And one guy is totally ripped open at the chest, and so on and so forth. These are like scenes out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting from medieval Europe, or something that used to fixate on the horrors of pandemics and epidemics and plagues and all sorts of other wartime catastrophes, and that's basically what you're living through. It's some sort of flashback, but it's for real. It's not in a painting. Let's see. I don't want to belabor those. Just a couple of more examples, and I'll get to the end because it's just more and more and more of the same. In the morning, the sentry on our left flank was shot through both cheeks. The blood spurted out of him in thick gouts, and to cap it all, when Lieutenant von Eval, visiting our sector, took to take pictures barely 50 yards away, turned to climb down from the outlook. A bullet shattered the back of his skull, and he died on the spot. Large fragments of skull were left littering the sentry platform. Also, a man was hit in the shoulder, but not badly. In the early morning fog, as we were repairing our wires on the right, we came upon a French corpse that must have been there for months. A crumbled trench walls exposed lines of bodies left there from the previous autumn's fighting. Right? As I said, they were just encased in the cold and the snow for the whole winter, and must have died in the autumn. And then when the thaw came in the spring, suddenly they reappeared. And then on page 54, as we noted when we talked about trench warfare, rats we go after with steel traps. Admittedly, the beasts are so strong that they try and take the traps with them. Their noisy efforts bring us charging out of our dugouts to finish them off with clubs. We've even devised a type of hunt for the mice who nibble our bread. We all but empty a cartridge, and using a paper pellet for a bullet, we try to shoot them with that. Remember the scene in All Quiet on the Western Front when all of a sudden the rats start pouring in droves into the trench and start going at the bread, loaves of bread, and so on. Same idea. On the 24th of November, a machine gunner was gravely wounded in the head in our sector, and half an hour later, another man in our company had his cheek laid open by infantry fire. And these are just, one after another without any kind of sober reflection or any kind of, emotional or spiritual or other, reaction to what's going on. It's just, that's what it is. And, no problem. As Christmas approached, the weather seemed to worsen. We had recourse to pumps in our efforts to do something about the water. Remember, that was the other problem, that these trenches become waterlogged. And that, of course, led to yet other diseases and to infections and so on and so forth. But they had to find ways to pump the water out. During this muddy phase, our losses also worsened. So for instance, I find in my diary for the 12th of December, today we buried 7 men in Douchy and 2 more were shot. And for the 23rd of December, mud and filth are getting the better of us. This morning at 3 o'clock, an enormous deposit came down at the entrance to my dugout. I had to employ 3 men who were barely able to bail the water that poured like a freshet into my dugout. Our trench is drowning, and the morass is now up to our navels. It's just desperate. On the right edge of our frontage, another corpse has begun to appear. So far, just the legs. But that's the other issue. Many soldiers died in the trench not because of disease or because some projectile found its way into the trench. They drowned in the trenches because they became inundated with melting snow and all sorts of water coming down mountainsides. And they couldn't pump the water out fast enough. And so it's actually drowned in the trench itself. Again, he goes on and on with this. And he talks about the times he was injured and so on. Just want to read one passage. It's in the middle of page 92. If a man falls, he's left to die. No one can help. No one knows if he'll return alive. Every day we're attacked, they won't get through. Everyone knows this is about life and death. Nothing was left in this voice but equanimity, apathy. Fire had burned everything else out of it. It's men like that that you need for fighting. What kind of men? Men who've lost it. They don't care anymore. You'll see this in some of the poems. The only way to survive is just not care. Become totally insensitive. He said, those are the kind of men we need. They're apathetic about life and death. They just go and do what they have to do. We were marching along a wide road which ran into the moonlight like a white ribbon across the dark countryside towards the thunder of guns whose voracious roar grew ever more immeasurable. Abandon all hope. What gave the scene a particularly sinister aspect was the way the roads were clearly visible, like a net of white veins in the moonlight. What is that? Abandon all hope. Anyone? Okay, so one of the greatest pieces, he makes all these allusions to medieval literature and medieval art and so on, because all the horrors of the Middle Ages are appropriate analogies to World War I. One of the greatest works of all was Dante's Divina Commedia, Dante's Divine Comedy. And the Divine Comedy is divided into 3 parts. It takes place on Good Friday and goes the next day, and then to Easter Sunday. Covers 3 days. And it's basically it's like this. The author, Dante, has reached midlife. And midlife in those days, you figure 70 is, you're 70, so midlife is 35. And he's lived a certain life. So now he wonders what's going to happen. If I keep going in the same direction in my life, where am I going to end up at the end? What's ahead of me? So he employs the guidance of Virgil, the Roman writer, poet, and he's going to show him what you can look forward to in the afterlife, depending upon how you live your life. And first comes the Inferno, hell. For those people who committed the worst sins in life, they have no hope. They're going straight to hell. Don't pass go. Don't collect $200. It's a monopoly. And how do you know you're going into hell? Because there's a big sign that tells you where you're going. It's welcome to New Jersey. No, actually, it says, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Meaning, it's all over. There's no getting out of hell. It just gets worse because there are different levels of hell, but it's forever. Then there's purgatorio. Those people who committed sins that are not exactly quite worthy of going to hell, but they're not exactly worthy of going to heaven. So they have to be purged. They have to be cleansed. So they go to purgatorio. And then, best of all, for those truly righteous or those who've been cleansed, last stop is paradiso, heaven. So that's Dante Alighieri's Divina Commedia, Divine Comedy. And like I said, the first part begins in hell. And at the entrance to hell is the big sign that says, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And that's what he's alluding to, looking at the scene in the forest. It's like Dante's hell, abandon all hope because it's all over. You're not getting out of here. And he goes on and on to explain all of the additional incidents and scenes of suffering, dying, pain, and moaning and groaning and everything else, until finally you get to the end. And the British are gaining and not looking good. And he's finally at his last assault. This is in July of 1918. We moved into our rest quarters in France, a delightful spot in the Artois, surrounded by water. A few days later, we marched further back, and a quiet working class suburb cast out, as it were, by the rather fancier Cambrai. Cambrai is one of the last and important battles of the war. And then he says, he's in this village, the village is badly shelled. And then a figure in brown corduroy strode with equanimity across the fire-swept piece of terrain and shook me by the hand. Kies and boys, Captain Juncker and Schapper, Schrader, Schläger, Heinz, Feindeisen, Hurleman, Hoppenrath stood behind a hedge, raked with lead and iron, and talked through the attack. On many a day of wrath, we had fought on one and the same battlefield. And today, once more, the sun, now low in the western sky, was to gild the blood of all our, or nearly all. So it's very interesting, a very poetic way to discuss this, describe the end of this horrible battle. It's just a battle, it's a horrible war. And how does he describe it? But it's still consistent with his view of the world. He's on the battlefield. He's left with some of his comrades. And he said, on many occasions, we fought together on this very same battlefield. Because at the end of World War I, the Germans made one last offensive. They thought maybe they could still pull it off. But they didn't, right? And this is the last hurrah. So we fought on this battlefield many times. And today, once more, the sun, now low in the western sky, was to gild the blood of all or nearly all. So as we stand here on this battlefield, the sun is setting. The western sun, the sun sets in the west. The sun is setting in the west. And he gives it sort of this romantic or novelistic kind of a description, because the setting sun represents both the fact that the sun is setting for the German Empire and the German war effort, but it's gilding the blood of all or nearly all. Meaning what? To gild something means to give it a golden glow. But what is it gilding? It's gilding the blood of the battlefield, and consistent with the attitude of Junger, that war is this great, ennobling, brave undertaking. What he's saying is that even though this blood has been shed all over the place, uncounted, innumerable lives have been lost, the blood is drenching the earth, but the sun is gilding it. It's like giving it a war badge or medal of honor. It's making it gold. It's making it something positive and something that reflects bravery. So it reflects sacrifice and so on. So again, typical and consistent with his attitude towards war. Even though the loss is great and the blood is all over, it's been worth, it's been worth the sacrifice, because it's now been given the imprimatur, it's been given the ultimate seal of approval. It's covered with the gold that the sun is casting on it. And therefore it's like one huge pour la mérite, one huge gold medal, for service rendered. And then finally at the end, On one of those days, the 22nd of September, 1918, I received the following telegram. His Majesty the Kaiser has bestowed on you the Order Pour la Mérite. In the name of the whole division, I congratulate you. So he received his personal honor, the ultimate military award. And a few pages before, what he's basically saying is all of those soldiers, living and dead, have made the great sacrifice, and they've been awarded the great gold medal of honor as the sun gilds all of their blood on the battlefield of Western Europe. So very unique approach to warfare. One could say maybe a typically German approach to warfare, but certainly at odds with everything else we've read, and a great contrast you'll see when we do the poetry the next time of World War I. Now, interestingly, of all the genre of literature that you connect to World War I, poems are the most famous. Somehow poems are what one thinks of. There are plenty of novels, and even a couple of plays, but poems sort of capture the heart of World War I, and especially poems by British poets. They were the most famous. And many of those British poets, as you'll see, virtually all of them were veterans of World War I. And many of them actually died in battle, and the poems appeared posthumously after their death. So for the most part, I've chosen poems by the most outstanding and well-known British poets, and the most famous poems of all. I added, however, one other poem. It's very long, so when we get to it, I'll just tell you why I added it. It's from a German poet. Actually, I should take that back. He was not a poet. He was actually a lawyer who could have easily avoided service because he already fought in the Franco-Prussian War and frankly was too old, but insisted that he felt it an obligation to fight for the fatherland. But it's a particularly tragic story. He didn't make it. He died in the Russian front, leaving behind young children. But this added tragedy and poignancy to that poem. So we'll talk about it when we get to it. But for the most part, the poems we're going to look at are by famous British poets and veterans of World War I. So they're in that packet. If you go to Blackboard, I believe actually the tab is Poems of World War I. That's actually the tab. And so start getting ready with those for Thursday. And we'll be looking at the poems, and then we'll be moving on, last but not least, well, we had two more takes, we only have one, to the artwork. Some very interesting artwork came out of World War I, and most of what we've been looking at is actually by, for the most part, German artists, but also some British. And they too were veterans of the war. And what happened to their artwork is a rather interesting story. Because when the Nazis came into power, they didn't look too kindly on these guys' representation of the horrors of war. Anyway, so that's what's coming up, and that's basically going to be the end. You know what? It's been such a bizarre year with all this. I can't keep track actually of time. It's sort of lost its normal flow and relativity, as Einstein would say. But I don't know. It's like, how long have we been doing this? And wasn't I doing this already last March? Or is this a new semester? Very, very unnerving. Hopefully, this is almost the end. We had a departmental meeting yesterday, and the good news is, barring some other horror story or other, we will be back in a classroom come September. The anticipation is that the fall semester will be back in the ivy-covered halls of Lehman College. Not the summer. Summer is still going to be online, but hopefully the fall. So don't give up. Or as Winston Churchill, my hero, once said, when you find yourself going through hell, keep going. Anyway, so that's Storm of Steel. Any questions about it, or any questions about anything, the final, term paper, whatever. Okay, so stay well and safe, and see you again on Thursday morning.